On a quiet street in Porto Alegre, Brazil, the Richthofen family appeared to have everything. Manfred and Marija Richthofen had built a life of comfort and success. Their spacious home in the upscale neighborhood of Cidade Jardim spoke of years of hard work and careful planning. Manfred, a respected psychiatrist, spent his days helping others navigate their darkest thoughts. Marija, a former psychologist herself, had devoted her life to their only child. That child was Suzanne, beautiful, intelligent, and seemingly devoted to her parents. She was their pride and joy, the center of their universe. They had given her everything: education at the finest schools, material comforts, and boundless love. To neighbors and friends, the Richthofens were the model family. But beneath the surface of this perfect facade, something was festering, something dark and dangerous that no one could see. On October 31st, 2002, that darkness would emerge in the most horrifying way imaginable. As Halloween night descended over Porto Alegre, the Richthofens prepared for bed, unaware that they were living their final hours, unaware that the greatest threat to their lives wasn't a stranger breaking in from the outside. It was already inside their home. November 1st, 2002 dawned gray and overcast. At the Richthofen residence, an eerie silence hung in the air. No lights turned on. No movement behind the curtains. The house that usually showed signs of life by 7 in the morning remained dark and still. Suzanne Richthofen, 19 years old, arrived at the house around mid-morning. She wasn't alone. Her boyfriend, Daniel Cravinhos, was with her. To anyone watching, they appeared to be a young couple stopping by to visit her parents. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But when Suzanne inserted her key into the lock and pushed open the door, she began to scream. Neighbors would later recall the sound. Piercing, hysterical, the kind of scream that makes your blood run cold. Daniel called the police. His voice, captured on the emergency recording, sounded shaken. There had been a break-in, he said. Something terrible had happened. They needed help immediately. When the first responders arrived at the scene, what they found was beyond anything they could have prepared for. The bodies of Manfred and Marija Richthofen lay in their bed, surrounded by a scene of unthinkable violence. The brutality of the attack was shocking even to seasoned investigators. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely. Something personal. Something filled with rage. And as the investigators began to process the scene, small details started to emerge that didn't quite add up. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below and let me know. It's fascinating to think about people all over the world listening to these stories at different times of day and night. The master bedroom told a story written in blood and violence. Manfred Richthofen, 62 years old, had been struck repeatedly. The wounds suggested a blunt instrument, heavy, wielded with force and fury. Marija, too, had suffered a similar fate. The medical examiner would later count the blows, each one representing a moment of sustained, deliberate violence. But it was the staging that caught the investigators' attention. Drawers had been pulled open, contents scattered across the floor, jewelry boxes overturned, the classic signs of a burglary. Yet experienced eyes noticed something odd. The disarray seemed almost theatrical, too obvious, too convenient. Detective Paulo Santos stood in the doorway, taking in the scene. He had investigated hundreds of crimes over his 20-year career. Home invasions, robberies, crimes of passion, and something about this scene bothered him. The violence was extreme, suggesting a personal motive. But the staging suggested a planned cover-up. Outside, Suzanne was being comforted by relatives who had rushed to the scene. Her grief appeared overwhelming. She sobbed uncontrollably, her body shaking. Daniel stood nearby, his arm around her shoulders, his face pale. "We just came to visit," Suzanne told the police between sobs. "We found them like this. Someone broke in. Someone killed my parents." It was a simple explanation, a tragic but straightforward case of a home invasion ending in murder. The kind of crime that, while horrific, made sense in its brutality. But Detective Santos couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, and as he looked closer at the evidence, his suspicions only grew stronger. In the days following the murders, the police worked methodically to build their case. The forensics team combed through every inch of the Richthofen home, collecting evidence, taking photographs, documenting everything. What they found began to paint a troubling picture. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no damaged locks. Whoever had entered the house had either had a key or had been let in willingly. The alarm system, which should have been triggered, had been deactivated from the inside. The items reported stolen were valuable jewelry, cash, electronics. But other valuables, easily accessible and far more expensive, had been left behind. It was as if the thief knew exactly what to take and what to ignore. And then there was the matter of the dog. The Richthofens had a small dog that typically barked at strangers. According to neighbors, the dog had been quiet that night. No barking. No signs of distress. It suggested the intruder was someone the animal knew. Detective Santos requested Suzanne and Daniel come in for questioning. Standard procedure, he assured them, just to get their statements, to understand what they had seen when they arrived at the house. Both agreed without hesitation. Suzanne's statement was emotional but detailed. She and Daniel had spent Halloween night together at his family's home. They had arrived at her parents' house the next morning to have lunch with them, as planned. When no one answered the door, she had used her key to enter. That's when they made the horrifying discovery. Daniel's statement corroborated every detail. They had been together all night. They had witnesses. His family could confirm it. It seemed airtight. But Detective Santos had learned long ago that the most convincing lies are the ones closest to the truth. To understand what happened in that house on October 31st, you have to understand Suzanne Richthofen. Born in 1983, she was the only child of parents who had waited years to have a baby. When she finally arrived, she became the center of their world. Friends and family described a childhood that looked perfect from the outside. Ballet lessons, piano lessons, the best schools. Suzanne was intelligent and performed well academically. She was beautiful, with dark hair and striking features. She seemed to have everything. But those who knew the family well noticed something else. The Richthofens, particularly Marija, were extraordinarily protective of their daughter. Some might say overprotective. They monitored her friendships closely. They had high expectations for her behavior, her grades, her future. As Suzanne entered her teenage years, the tension began to show. She wanted independence. They wanted control. She wanted to make her own choices. They wanted to guide every decision. It was a classic parent-teenager conflict, but in the Richthofen household, it ran deeper than normal growing pains. At 18, Suzanne met Daniel Cravinhos. He was everything her parents didn't want for her. He came from a working-class background. He hadn't gone to university. He worked odd jobs and had dreams of becoming a musician. He was also intensely devoted to Suzanne, and she to him. The Richthofens disapproved immediately. They tried to forbid the relationship. They argued that Daniel wasn't good enough for their daughter, that he had no future, that Suzanne was throwing away her potential. But Suzanne refused to end the relationship. For perhaps the first time in her life, she openly defied her parents. And the more they pushed against Daniel, the more determined she became to stay with him. The conflict escalated throughout 2002. There were heated arguments, threats. Manfred and Marija threatened to cut Suzanne off financially if she didn't end the relationship. They talked about sending her away to study abroad, separating her from Daniel. Suzanne felt trapped. She loved her boyfriend, but she was financially dependent on her parents. She was only 19. She had no job, no savings, no way to support herself. And somewhere in that toxic mix of love, control, defiance, and desperation, a terrible idea began to form. Daniel Cravinhos had a younger brother named Christian. At 17, Christian was in many ways Daniel's opposite. Where Daniel was soft-spoken and romantic, Christian was aggressive and volatile. He had a history of petty crimes and had been in trouble with the law before. But he was loyal to his brother, fiercely loyal. And when Daniel's relationship with Suzanne became serious, Christian became part of their extended circle. He watched as the conflict between Suzanne and her parents intensified. He heard the stories of arguments, of threats, of Suzanne's tears. In the weeks before the murders, a plan began to take shape. The details would later be disputed, with each participant claiming the others had been the instigator. But the evidence suggested that all three, Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian, were involved in planning what would happen on Halloween night 2002. The plan was cold and calculated. Suzanne would go out with Daniel on Halloween night, establishing an alibi. They would spend the evening at his family's home, where others would see them and remember their presence. Meanwhile, Christian would go to the Richthofen house. Suzanne had arranged for the door to be left unlocked. She had deactivated the alarm system before leaving. She had made sure the dog would recognize the intruder and wouldn't bark. Every detail had been considered. According to later testimony, the original plan was for it to look like a robbery. Take some valuables. Make it appear random. The killing would be quick, they told themselves. Her parents wouldn't suffer. But plans made in the abstract often fall apart when they meet reality. October 31st, 2002. While children across Porto Alegre went trick-or-treating and families celebrated Halloween, a different kind of horror was being set in motion. Suzanne spent the evening at Daniel's family home, just as planned. Multiple witnesses would later confirm she was there from early evening until the next morning. She laughed, she talked, she appeared relaxed and happy. If she was thinking about what was happening at her parents' house, she gave no sign. At the Richthofen residence, Manfred and Marija prepared for bed. It had been an ordinary day. Manfred had seen patients at his clinic. Marija had run errands and done household tasks. They had no idea that their daughter had unlocked a door to their bedroom earlier that day. No idea that the alarm system they trusted had been disabled. Around midnight, Christian Cravinhos entered the house. He wasn't alone. According to later testimony, Daniel had joined him, slipping away from his family home while Suzanne remained there to maintain the alibi. The brothers moved through the dark house, knowing exactly where to go. They had brought with them a crowbar and a pair of iron bars. Heavy, blunt instruments capable of inflicting tremendous damage. As they approached the master bedroom, they could hear the sound of Manfred snoring. What happened next was brutal beyond imagination. The first blow struck Manfred as he slept. Then another, and another. Marija woke to the nightmare, seeing shadowy figures attacking her husband. Her screams were cut short by blows to her own head. The violence continued far beyond what was necessary to kill. The medical examiner would later count more than 40 separate wounds between the two victims. This wasn't just murder. This was rage unleashed. This was sustained, deliberate brutality. When it was finally over, the brothers stood in a bedroom painted with blood. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And in that moment, they had to decide what to do next. The brothers worked quickly. They knew they had limited time before anyone might notice something was wrong. Following the plan, they began staging the scene to look like a burglary. They ransacked drawers, scattering clothes and papers. They took jewelry, cash, and small electronics, items a burglar might grab quickly. They tried to make it look random, chaotic, the work of strangers looking for quick valuables. But in their panic and inexperience, they made mistakes. They left behind more expensive items that any real burglar would have taken. The staging looked forced, theatrical. And they couldn't clean up all the blood. The sheer amount of it made that impossible. Daniel returned to his family's home, slipping back in during the early morning hours. When he rejoined Suzanne, she asked the question they had agreed on, "Is it done?" He nodded. Her parents were dead. There was no going back now. They spent the rest of the night at Daniel's house, maintaining their alibi. To the family members around them, they appeared to be a normal young couple, sleeping peacefully while the world continued around them. But in Suzanne's mind, thoughts must have been racing. Her parents were dead. She had helped plan their murders. And tomorrow, She would have to return to the house and pretend to discover their bodies. She would have to act surprised, horrified, grief-stricken. She would have to be convincing. Their lives depended on it. The next morning, Suzanne and Daniel drove to the Richthofen house, just as they had planned. As they pulled up to the quiet suburban home, Suzanne prepared herself for the performance of her life. She had no way of knowing that the investigators were already beginning to suspect the truth. Detective Santos watched Suzanne carefully as she gave her statement. He had interviewed countless grieving family members over his career, and something about her demeanor troubled him. Her grief seemed performative, loud, dramatic, but somehow lacking genuine emotion beneath the surface. There were small inconsistencies in her story. Nothing major, but enough to raise questions. She said she and Daniel had arrived at the house around mid-morning, but a neighbor reported seeing Daniel's car parked on the street much earlier, around dawn. She claimed they had immediately called the police upon discovering the bodies, but the timestamp on the emergency call didn't match her timeline. There was a gap of nearly 20 minutes between when she said they arrived and when the call was made. And then there was her behavior after the discovery. While understandably distraught, she seemed more concerned about certain items that had been stolen than about the brutal deaths of her parents. She asked repeatedly about her mother's jewelry, about whether the police would recover it. Detective Santos requested permission to search Daniel's family home. It was a courtesy request. He could have obtained a warrant, but he wanted to see their reaction. Suzanne and Daniel exchanged a quick glance, barely perceptible, before agreeing. The search turned up nothing immediately incriminating, but forensics did find traces of blood on shoes belonging to Christian Cravinhos. When questioned, Christian claimed he had cut himself recently. It was possible. It was also suspicious. The detective began pulling on threads, interviewing friends, family members, neighbors, and slowly, a picture began to emerge of a relationship that the Richthofens had desperately opposed. A relationship that Suzanne had been willing to fight for, no matter the cost. 3 days after the murders, Detective Santos received a call from a friend of Suzanne's. She had information, she said. Information that the police needed to hear. Her name was Gabriella, and she had known Suzanne since childhood. They had been close friends for years, sharing secrets and confidences the way teenage girls do. But the secret Gabriella was about to share would change everything. In Detective Santos's office, Gabriella sat nervously, twisting her hands. She didn't want to believe it, she said. She had tried to convince herself it wasn't true, but she couldn't stay silent any longer. About 3 weeks before the murders, Gabriella began, Suzanne told me she wished her parents were dead. It wasn't said in anger during an argument, Gabriella explained. It was said calmly, almost casually, during a conversation about Suzanne's relationship problems. When Gabriella had expressed shock, Suzanne had laughed it off, saying she was just venting. But then, a week before Halloween, Suzanne had said something else, something that Gabriella couldn't forget. She asked me what I would do if I found out someone close to me had done something terrible, Gabriella said quietly. Like, hypothetically, if I knew someone was planning to hurt someone else, would I tell? Gabriella had assumed it was an abstract question. Maybe Suzanne had heard about something happening at school. She had assured her friend that she would always do the right thing. Suzanne had nodded and changed the subject. But Gabriella remembered the look in her eyes, calculating, distant, like she was working through a problem in her head. And then, the day after the murders, Suzanne had called Gabriella. She was crying, hysterical, explaining what had happened. And Gabriella had comforted her, supported her, believed her, until she started thinking about those earlier conversations. Until she started noticing the inconsistencies in Suzanne's story. Until she couldn't ignore the terrible possibility any longer. Detective Santos thanked Gabriella for her courage in coming forward. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. It was time to bring Suzanne, Daniel, and Christian in for more serious questioning. This time, there would be no gentle courtesy interviews. This time, they would be questioned as suspects. The interrogation room was small and windowless, designed to be uncomfortable. Suzanne sat across from Detective Santos, her lawyer beside her. Gone was the hysterical, grieving daughter. In her place was someone cooler, more controlled. Santos laid out the evidence. The timeline that didn't match. The neighbor's testimony about Daniel's car. The suspicious blood on Christian's shoes. The friend's testimony about the conversations before the murders. Suzanne denied everything. She was being persecuted, she claimed. The police were looking for an easy solution instead of finding the real killers. She was the victim here. She had lost her parents. But Detective Santos had been doing this for a long time. He knew that maintaining a lie under pressure required consistency, and consistency required truth. All he had to do was find the cracks. "Tell me about your relationship with your parents," he said, changing tactics. Suzanne's jaw tightened. It was complicated. Complicated how? They were controlling, especially about Daniel. They didn't approve of him. That must have been frustrating. Of course it was frustrating. I loved him. They couldn't see that. Santos leaned forward. Did you ever wish they would just go away? Let you live your life? Everyone fights with their parents. It doesn't mean. Did you ever wish they were dead? Suzanne? The question hung in the air. Suzanne's eyes flashed with something. Anger? Fear? "I want a lawyer," she said. In another room, Daniel Cravinhos was facing similar questioning. And unlike Suzanne, he was cracking. His hands shook. He couldn't maintain eye contact. When asked about his whereabouts on Halloween night, his story began to shift. First, he had been at his family's home all night. Then, he admitted he had stepped out briefly, just for a walk, to clear his head. "Where did you walk to, Daniel?" "Just around the neighborhood." "Did you go to the Richthofen house?" "No, I was just walking." But his voice lacked conviction. And when the detective mentioned Christian's blood-stained shoes, Daniel's face went pale. In the third interrogation room, Christian Cravinhos sat in sullen silence. Christian was 17, legally still a minor, but he had the hard eyes of someone much older. He had been in trouble before: petty theft, assault. He knew how these interrogations worked. Stay silent. Don't give them anything. Wait for the lawyer. But Detective Santos had a different approach for Christian. He didn't ask about the murders. Instead, he talked about the future. "You're 17, Santos said. "Still young. Your whole life ahead of you. But you know what happens to people who get convicted of murder in Brazil, right? Especially brutal murders like this one." Christian said nothing, but his jaw tensed. "You'd go to adult prison. Not juvenile detention. Adult prison. And for a crime this violent, you'd be looking at decades. You'd be an old man before you saw freedom again." Santos let that sink in. Then he leaned closer. "But here's the thing, Christian. I don't think this was your idea. I think someone talked you into it. Someone convinced you to do something you never would have done on your own." For the first time, Christian looked directly at the detective. "What if you weren't the mastermind?" Santos continued. "What if you were just following orders?" The courts look at that differently. Cooperation, testimony against the real planners, that changes everything. Christian's hands clenched into fists on the table. Santos could see the internal battle playing out on the young man's face. Loyalty versus self-preservation. Love for his brother versus the reality of spending his life in prison. "She planned it," Christian finally whispered. "Suzanne. It was all her idea." And with those words, the dam broke. Christian began talking, and what he revealed was even more disturbing than the investigators had imagined. According to Christian's testimony, the plan to kill Manfred and Marija Richthofen had been in development for months. It hadn't been a sudden impulse or a moment of rage. It had been carefully, methodically planned. Suzanne had first mentioned the idea in August 2002. She and Daniel had been arguing about her parents' interference in their relationship, and she had said, almost casually, that life would be so much easier if her parents just didn't exist. Daniel had thought she was joking, but Suzanne kept bringing it up. She talked about the life insurance policies her parents had. She talked about the inheritance she would receive. She talked about how, with her parents gone, she and Daniel could finally be together without anyone standing in their way. Slowly, the idea had gone from a dark fantasy to a genuine plan. Suzanne drew her boyfriend deeper in, making him complicit, getting him to agree. And then she involved Christian, knowing his loyalty to his brother and his willingness to do things others wouldn't. The three of them had met multiple times to discuss the details: how to get into the house, how to make it look like a robbery, how to establish alibis. Suzanne had been the architect of it all, anticipating problems, adjusting the plan. On Halloween night, everything had gone according to plan. Almost. The brothers had entered the house through the door Suzanne had left unlocked. They had gone to the master bedroom. They had attacked Manfred and Marija with the iron bars and crowbar. But the reality of killing had been different than they had imagined. Christian described it in horrible detail. The sounds, the blood, the way it had seemed to go on forever. Both brothers had participated in the violence, taking turns striking the victims. When it was over, they had staged the burglary scene and fled. They had taken the stolen items to a prearranged location where Suzanne could collect them later. Then Daniel had returned to his family's home, and Christian had gone into hiding. The next morning, Suzanne and Daniel had gone to discover the bodies, exactly as planned. It should have been the perfect crime, but they hadn't counted on one thing: the weight of guilt and the pressure of investigation breaking their united front. On November 8, 2002, just 8 days after the murders, police arrested Suzanne Richthofen, Daniel Cravinhos, and Christian Cravinhos. The charges were formal and severe: conspiracy to commit murder and murder with aggravating circumstances. The news sent shockwaves through Brazil. The story had everything that captures public attention: a wealthy family, a forbidden romance, and a crime of almost unthinkable brutality. The media descended on the case, and it quickly became one of the most high-profile criminal cases in Brazilian history. Suzanne was taken to a women's detention center. Photographs from her arrest show a young woman with a blank expression, almost serene, as if she couldn't quite comprehend what was happening. There were no tears now, no hysterical grief, just an eerie calm. Daniel appeared devastated, his face reflecting the horror of what he had participated in. In his first statement after arrest, he broke down, claiming he had never wanted any of this. But he had loved Suzanne, and love had led him down a path to darkness. Christian, the youngest, seemed almost defiant. He had confessed, yes, but he showed little remorse. He had done it for his brother, he said. Loyalty meant everything. As the three awaited trial, investigators continued building their case. They traced the stolen items, some of which had been found in Daniel's possession. They analyzed the crime scene evidence. They interviewed dozens of witnesses who could testify to Suzanne's troubled relationship with her parents and her increasingly desperate desire to be free of their control. But the most damning evidence would come from the suspects themselves. In the days and weeks following their arrests, each of them would make statements, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes corroborating, but always painting a picture of a conspiracy that had ended in bloodshed. The Richthofen family, what remained of it, demanded justice. Manfred's brother issued a statement expressing his horror that his own niece could have been involved in such a crime. Marija's sister spoke to the press about the grief of losing someone she loved to violence orchestrated by their own child. And across Brazil, people asked themselves the same question: how could a daughter murder her own parents? The trial would attempt to answer that question. The trial of Suzanne Richthofen and the Cravinhos brothers began in July 2006, nearly 4 years after the murders. The delay had only intensified public interest. When the courthouse doors opened on the first day, hundreds of people crowded outside, many holding signs demanding justice for Manfred and Marija. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Suzanne sat at the defense table, now 23 years old, her appearance carefully controlled. She wore conservative clothing and minimal makeup, her lawyers clearly trying to present her as young and sympathetic rather than as the cold-blooded killer the prosecution would paint her as. Daniel and Christian sat separately, each with their own legal teams. The strategy was already clear. Each defendant would try to minimize their own role while implicating the others. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the forensic evidence, the blood spatter patterns showing the brutality of the attack, the autopsy reports detailing every wound inflicted on Manfred and Marija. The jury was shown photographs of the crime scene, and several people in the gallery visibly recoiled. Then came the testimony. Friends and family members described the toxic relationship between Suzanne and her parents. Neighbors testified about the arguments they had overheard. Gabriella, Suzanne's former friend, took the stand and repeated the conversations that had first raised her suspicions. The prosecution built a picture of Suzanne as the mastermind, a young woman so desperate to be with Daniel and so resentful of her parents' control that she had orchestrated their murders. They presented evidence of the financial motive, the life insurance and inheritance that Suzanne would receive. But the defense had a different story to tell. Suzanne's lawyers argued that she had been manipulated by the Cravinhos brothers, particularly by the violent Christian. They painted her as a victim of domestic abuse, controlled by a boyfriend who had isolated her and turned her against her family. It was a dramatic claim, and one that the prosecution vigorously disputed. But it played into certain narratives about young women in abusive relationships, and it gave some jurors pause. As the trial continued, the nation watched, transfixed by the unfolding drama. If you're still listening at this point, pause for a moment and tell me, where in the world are you right now and what time is it? I'm curious to know how many of you are listening late at night and how many are tuning in during the day. Leave a comment below. When Suzanne took the stand, the courtroom fell absolutely silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, to hear, in her own words, what had happened. Suzanne's testimony was careful and controlled. Yes, she admitted she had known about the plan to kill her parents, but she claimed she had never believed it would really happen. She thought it was just talk, just fantasy, the kind of dark thoughts people have when they're angry and frustrated. I never actually wanted them dead, she said, her voice steady. I loved my parents, despite our problems. The prosecution challenged her immediately. If she didn't want it to happen, why had she left the door unlocked? Why had she deactivated the alarm? Why had she established an alibi? Suzanne faltered. She had been coerced, she said. Daniel and Christian had threatened her. She had been afraid of what they might do if she didn't cooperate. She was a victim too. But under cross-examination, her story began to fall apart. The prosecutor presented evidence of conversations Suzanne had had with friends after the murders, where she had shown more concern about her inheritance than about her parents' deaths. He presented phone records showing she had called Daniel multiple times after the murders, asking about the stolen jewelry. If you were truly a victim, truly coerced, the prosecutor asked, why were you calling to check on the stolen items? Why were you concerned about your inheritance? Suzanne had no good answer. Daniel's testimony was different. He seemed genuinely remorseful, at times breaking down in tears. He admitted his role in the murders, describing in painful detail the events of that night. But he insisted that Suzanne had been the driving force. She told me her parents would never let us be together, Daniel said. She said they were planning to send her away, to cut her off completely. She said this was the only way. He described how Suzanne had planned every detail, how she had manipulated him and his brother into believing this was necessary. He claimed to have loved her so much that he had been willing to do anything she asked. Christian's testimony was the most chilling. He showed little emotion as he described the murders. He had done it for his brother, he said simply. Daniel had asked him to help, and family loyalty meant everything. But he also confirmed that Suzanne had been the planner. She had provided the access, the timing, the details. Without her, none of it would have been possible. After weeks of testimony and days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with people standing in the aisles and pressed against the walls. Outside, thousands more waited, watching on screens that had been set up to broadcast the proceedings. The judge asked the defendants to rise. Suzanne stood, her face pale but composed. Daniel's hands were shaking. Christian looked straight ahead, his expression unreadable. In the matter of the state versus Suzanne Louise von Richthofen, the judge began. The verdict: guilty of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. Guilty of conspiracy. Guilty on all counts. There was a collective gasp from the gallery. Suzanne showed no reaction, but her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder to steady her. In the matter of the state versus Daniel Cravinhos de Paula e Silva. Guilty on all counts. In the matter of the state versus Christian Cravinhos de Paula e Silva. Guilty on all counts. Now came sentencing. In Brazil, the maximum sentence for any crime is 30 years, but the judge had discretion in how that sentence would be structured. Suzanne received 39 years and 8 months, though she would serve the maximum of 30. Daniel received 38 years and 8 months. Christian, who had been a minor at the time of the crime, received 38 years and 8 months as well, though he would serve time in juvenile facilities until he turned 18. The sentences were among the harshest ever handed down for murder in Brazil. The judge, in explaining the severity, cited the exceptional brutality of the crime and the fact that it had been committed against the defendant's own family members. As the verdicts were read, chaos erupted in the courtroom. Some people cheered, others wept. Members of the Richthofen family embraced each other, finding some measure of closure in the justice that had been served. Suzanne was led away in handcuffs, her face now showing the first crack in her composure. Tears streamed down her cheeks, though whether they were tears of remorse or simply fear of what lay ahead was impossible to say. But the Richthofen case wasn't over. In the years to come, there would be appeals, parole hearings, and continued public fascination with the woman who had killed her parents for love and money. Suzanne Richthofen entered the Brazilian prison system as one of its most notorious inmates. In the Penitenciaria Feminina de Capital, she was both reviled and, strangely, something of a celebrity. Other inmates knew her story. Some sympathized with her, others despised her. Prison records show that Suzanne adapted to life behind bars with remarkable efficiency. She earned a law degree while incarcerated, studying through distance learning programs. She worked in the prison library. She maintained a low profile, avoiding trouble. But perhaps most controversially, she also maintained her relationship with Daniel Cravinhos, at least for a time. The two exchanged letters for years, professing their continued love for each other. When this became public knowledge, it sparked outrage. How could they still claim to love each other after what they had done? Eventually, the relationship ended. Daniel, imprisoned in a different facility, reportedly told other inmates that he had finally accepted the depth of what they had done. The love that had seemed worth killing for had become a source of profound shame. Christian, the youngest, struggled most with incarceration. He had multiple disciplinary incidents and spent significant time in solitary confinement. Unlike his brother, he showed little interest in rehabilitation programs. The system had labeled him a lost cause. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, the Richthofen case continued to fascinate Brazil. Books were written about it. Documentaries were produced. A feature film was released in 2008, though the Richthofen family fought unsuccessfully to prevent its distribution. The case became a reference point in discussions about family dysfunction, toxic relationships, and the dark side of love. Psychologists analyzed Suzanne's motives, trying to understand how a 19-year-old could orchestrate the murder of her own parents. Some argued she was a sociopath, incapable of genuine empathy or remorse. Others suggested she had been a product of an overbearing, controlling household that had stunted her emotional development. Still others pointed to the toxic influence of her relationship with Daniel, suggesting she had been manipulated. But perhaps the truth was simpler and more disturbing. Suzanne had wanted something: freedom, money, Daniel, and had been willing to kill to get it. In Brazilian law, prisoners can apply for semi-open detention after serving a portion of their sentence. This allows them to work outside the prison during the day while returning at night. It's a step toward eventual full release. In 2016, after serving 13 years, Suzanne Richthofen applied for semi-open detention. The request sparked immediate controversy. Victim advocacy groups protested. Members of the Richthofen family gave interviews expressing their horror that she might be granted any form of freedom. At the hearing, prosecutors argued that Suzanne remained a danger to society. They pointed to statements she had made in prison that seemed to show a lack of genuine remorse. They noted that she had never fully accepted responsibility for the murders, always trying to minimize her role. Suzanne's lawyers countered that she had been a model prisoner. She had earned a degree. She had had no disciplinary issues. She had participated in psychological counseling. She deserved a chance at rehabilitation. The judge denied the request. The crime, he ruled, was too serious. More time was needed. Suzanne tried again in 2019. This time, the request was granted, but with strict conditions. She could attend classes outside the prison and work, but she had to return each night. Any violation would result in immediate return to full imprisonment. The decision was met with outrage from many quarters. How could the woman who had orchestrated such a brutal crime be allowed any freedom? Didn't she deserve to spend her entire sentence behind bars? But Brazil's criminal justice system, like many around the world, is built on the principle of rehabilitation. The question isn't just about punishment, it's about whether a person can change, can be reformed, can eventually return to society. In Suzanne's case, that question remains deeply controversial. Her supporters point to her behavior in prison as evidence of change. Her detractors argue that no amount of good behavior can erase the horror of what she did. And the victims, Manfred and Marija Richthofen, remain dead, unable to speak for themselves about whether their daughter deserves mercy. More than 2 decades have passed since Halloween night 2002. The Richthofen murder case remains one of the most infamous crimes in Brazilian history, a cautionary tale that continues to resonate. What makes the case so compelling isn't just the brutality of the crime or the high-profile nature of the trial. It's the fundamental questions it raises about family, love, and the human capacity for evil. How does a daughter come to hate her parents so much that she plans their murders? How does love become so twisted that it leads to violence? How do 3 young people, none of them with a history of serious violence, come to commit such a brutal act? Psychologists and criminologists have studied the case extensively. Some point to the controlling nature of Manfred and Marija's parenting, suggesting it created a powder keg of resentment in their daughter. Others focus on the toxic dynamic of Suzanne's relationship with Daniel, a folie à deux where each reinforced the other's worst impulses. Still, others argue that trying to find a single cause is futile. The murders were the result of a perfect storm: parental control, teenage rebellion, financial dependence, romantic obsession, and the presence of individuals willing to cross moral boundaries. The case has had lasting impacts beyond the individuals involved. It led to changes in how Brazilian authorities handle cases involving family violence and conspiracy. It sparked conversations about parenting styles and the dangers of excessive control. It became a reference point in discussions about how media coverage can influence public perception of criminal cases. Today, Suzanne Richthofen is still serving her sentence, now in the semi-open system. She maintains a low profile, rarely speaking to the media. Daniel and Christian Cravinhos are also still imprisoned. All 3 will remain in the system for years to come. The Richthofen family home in Cidade Jardim was eventually sold. The new owners knew the history but tried to create new memories in a place marked by tragedy. Neighbors who remember that Halloween night still speak in hushed tones about what happened in the quiet house at the end of the street. And on October 31st each year, some people in Porto Alegre remember Manfred and Marija Richthofen, not as victims in a famous crime, but as people who loved their daughter and died at her hands, never understanding how their love had gone so terribly wrong. The Richthofen case reminds us that the greatest horrors sometimes come not from strangers in the night, but from those closest to us. That love, when twisted by obsession and resentment, can become the most dangerous force of all. And that the perfect family, the one that looks so ideal from the outside, may be hiding secrets that are darker than anyone could imagine. The rain continues to fall, washing away nothing, changing nothing. Some stains, some memories, some crimes, can never truly be cleansed, only remembered, only mourned, only learned from, if we're willing to look closely enough at the darkness within human hearts. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. I'd love to hear from you one last time. Where are you, and what time did you finish this story? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story kept you engaged, consider subscribing for more true crime narratives.